So today, our speaker who will take us through these dark and mythic woods and be with us in this journey is Dr. Stephenson, who is a remarkable scholar and clinician and a graduate of C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich and also graduate of Institute for Psychodrama and a Center of Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex. His books include Possession, Jung Comparative Anatomy of the Psyche, Anteros, A Forgotten Myth, Jung and Moreno, Essays on the Theater of Human Nature, and he is, in addition to practicing, is the Director of Training for the Jungian Psychoanalytic Association of New York City. So with that, please warmly welcome Dr. Stephenson in this next presentation. Thank you.
Good morning. Before we start, first of all, I would like to thank the program committee for inviting me. David Tacey was going to be giving this opening talk on Saturday morning, and he couldn't come at the last minute. So we're going to take a second here to travel across time and space and send good wishes to David Tacey in Australia. And since we're talking about time travel and space travel, coming from New York here to Pacifica for my first time, this is very exciting to be here with you. And the conference was kicked off last night with a brilliant lecture by Anne Olenov, who is a colleague of mine at the Jungian Psychoanalytic Association. And she's a neighbor who lives 2 blocks north of me in New York. So I'm looking down at her, and it's like taking a trip and never leaving the farm. Good morning, Anne. I'm going to read you a fairy tale to start you off. Bearskin. There was once a young fellow who enlisted as a soldier, conducted himself bravely, and was always the foremost when it rained bullets. So long as the war lasted, all went well. But when peace was made, he received his dismissal, and the captain said he might go where he liked. His parents were dead, and he no longer had a home. So he went to his brothers and begged them to take him in and keep him until war broke out again. The brothers, however, were hard-hearted. Note that, please. And said, what can we do with you? You're of no use to us. Go and make a living for yourself. The soldier had nothing left but his gun. So he took that on his shoulder and went forth into the world. He came to a wide heath on which nothing was to be seen but a circle of trees. Under these trees he sat sorrowfully down and began to think over his fate. I have no money, thought he. I've learned no trade but that of fighting, and now that they've made peace, they don't want me any longer, so I see beforehand that I shall have to starve. All at once he heard a rustling, and when he looked round, a strange man stood before him who wore a green coat and looked right stately, but had a hideous cloven foot. I know already what you are in need of, said the man. Gold and possessions shall you have, as much as you can make away with, do what you will. But first I must know if you are fearless, that I may not bestow my money in vain. A soldier and fearless? How can these two things go together? He answered. You can put me to the proof. Very well then, answered the man. Look behind you. The soldier turned round and saw a large bear which came growling towards him. Ho, ho, cried the soldier, I'll tickle your nose for you so that you shall soon lose your fancy for growling. And he aimed at the bear and shot it through the muzzle. It fell down and never stirred again. I see quite well, said the stranger, that you're not wanting in courage, but there's still another condition which you shall have to fulfill. If it does not endanger my salvation, replied the soldier, who knew very well who was standing by him. If it does, I'll have nothing to do with it. Well, you will look to that for yourself, answered Greencoat. You shall for the next 7 years neither wash yourself, nor comb your beard, nor your hair, nor cut your nails, nor once say the Lord's Prayer. I will give you a coat and a cloak, which during this time you must wear. If you die during these 7 years, you are mine. If you remain alive, you are free and rich to boot for all the rest of your life." The soldier thought of the great extremity in which he now found himself, and as he so often had gone to meet death, he resolved to risk it now also, and agreed to the terms. The devil took off his green coat and gave it to the soldier, and said, "If you have this coat on your back and put your hand into the pocket, you will always find it full of money." And then he pulled the skin off the bear and said, "This shall be your cloak, and your bed also, for thereon shall you sleep, and in no other bed shall you lie, and because of this apparel shall you be called bearskin." Whereupon the devil vanished. The soldier put the coat on, felt at once in the pocket, and found that the thing was really true. And then he put on the bearskin and went forth into the world and enjoyed himself, refraining from nothing that did him good and his money harm. During the first year, his appearance was passable, but during the second, he began to look like a monster. His hair covered nearly the whole of his face. His beard was like a piece of coarse felt. His fingers had claws. His face was so covered with dirt that if cress had been sown on it, it would have come up. Whosoever saw him ran away. But as he everywhere gave the poor money to pray that he might not die during the 7 years, and as he paid well for everything, he still always found shelter. In the 4th year, he entered an inn where the landlord would not receive him, would not even let him have a place in the stable because he was afraid the horses would be scared. But as Bearskin thrust his hand into his pocket and pulled out a handful of ducats, the host let himself be persuaded and gave him a room in an outhouse. Bearskin, however, was obliged to promise not to let himself be seen, lest the inn should get a bad name. As Bearskin was sitting alone in the evening and wishing from the bottom of his heart that the 7 years were over, he heard a loud lamenting in a neighboring room. He had a compassionate heart, and so he opened the door. And he saw an old man weeping bitterly and wringing his hands. Bearskin went nearer, but the man sprang to his feet and tried to escape from him. At last, when the man perceived that Bearskin's voice was human, he let himself be prevailed upon, and by kind words Bearskin succeeded so far that the old man revealed the cause of his grief. His property had dwindled away by degrees. He and his daughters would have to starve, and he was so poor that he could not pay the innkeeper and was to be put in prison. "Well, if that is your only trouble," said Bearskin, "I have plenty of money." He caused the innkeeper to be brought thither, paid him, and even put a purse full of gold into the poor old man's pocket. When the old man saw himself set free from his troubles, he did not know how to show his gratitude. "Come with me," said he to Bearskin. "My daughters are all miracles of beauty. Choose one of them for yourself as a wife. When she hears what you've done for me, she will not refuse you. You do, in truth, look a little strange, but she will soon put you to rights again." Well, this pleased Bearskin well, and he went. When the eldest saw him, she was so terribly alarmed at his face that she screamed and ran away. The second stood still and looked at him from head to foot, and then she said, "How can I accept a husband who no longer has a human form? The shaven bear that once was here and passed itself off for a man pleased me far better, for at any rate it wore a hussar's dress and white gloves. If he were only ugly, I might get used to that." The youngest, however, said, "Dear father, it must be a good man to have helped you out of your trouble. So if you've promised him a bride for doing it, your promise must be kept." It was a pity that Bearskin's face was covered with dirt and with hair, for if not, they might have seen how delighted he was when he heard these words. He took a ring from his finger, broke it in two, and gave her one half, and the other he kept for himself. He wrote his name on her half, and her name on his half, and he begged her to keep her peace carefully. And then he took his leave and said, I must still wander about for 3 years, and if I do not return, you are free, for I shall be dead. But pray to God to preserve my life. The poor betrothed bride dressed herself entirely in black, and when she thought of her future bridegroom, tears came into her eyes. Nothing but contempt and mockery fell to her lot from her sisters. Take care, said the eldest. If you give him your hand, he'll strike his claws into it. Beware, said the second. Bears like sweet things. If he takes a fancy to you, he'll eat you up. You must always do as he likes, began the elder again, or else he'll growl. And the second continued, but the wedding will be a merry one, for bears dance well. The bride was silent and did not let them vex her. Bearskin, however, traveled about the world from one place to another, did good when he was able, gave generously to the poor, that they might pray for him. At length, as the last day of the 7 years dawned, he went out once more onto the heath and seated himself beneath the circle of trees. And it was not long before the wind whistled, and the devil stood before him and looked angrily at him. And then he threw Bearskin his old coat and asked for his green one back. We've not got so far as that yet, answered Bearskin. You must first make me clean. And whether the devil liked it or not, he was forced to fetch water and wash Bearskin, comb his hair, cut his nails, and after this he looked like a brave soldier and was much handsomer than he had ever been before. When the devil had gone away, Bearskin was quite light-hearted. He went into the town, put on a magnificent velvet coat, seated himself in a carriage drawn by 4 white horses, and drove to his bride's house. No one recognized him. The father took him for a distinguished general and led him into the room where his daughters were sitting. He was forced to place himself between the 2 eldest, who helped him to wine, gave him the best pieces of meat, and thought that in all the world they had never seen a handsomer man. The bride, however, sat opposite to him in her black dress and never raised her eyes, nor spoke a word. And when at length he asked the father if he would give him one of his daughters to wife, the 2 eldest jumped up, ran into their bedrooms to put on splendid dresses, for each of them fancied she was the chosen one. The stranger, as soon as he was alone with his bride, brought out his half of the ring and threw it in a glass of wine, which he handed across the table to her. She took the wine, but when she had drunk it and found the half ring lying at the bottom, her heart began to beat. She got the other half, which she wore on a ribbon round her neck, joined them, and saw that the 2 pieces fitted exactly together. Then said he, I am your betrothed bridegroom, whom you saw as Bearskin, but through God's grace I have again received my human form and have once more become clean. He went up to her, embraced her, and gave her a kiss. In the meantime, the 2 sisters came back in full dress, and when they saw that the handsome man had fallen to the share of the youngest and heard that he was Bearskin, they ran out full of anger and rage. One of them drowned herself in the well, the other hanged herself on a tree. In the evening, someone knocked at the door, and when the bridegroom opened it, it was the devil in his green coat, who said, You see, I have now got 2 souls in the place of your one. In 1857, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm introduced into their definitive 7th edition of Children and Household Tales a story that today is not well known. Bearskin describes a fearless soldier who returns from war to find himself without work. It's peacetime and he knows only how to shoot. And without a home, his parents have died and his hard-hearted brothers have forsaken him. Now, oddly, Bearskin did not appear in the first 4 versions of the Grimm's collection. Beginning with the 1815 edition, but it found its way into the 5th edition, published in 1843. In the first editions, the Grimms included another story, The Devil's Green Jacket, about a foolish young man who squanders his inheritance and then bargains with the devil to wear a magical waistcoat whose pockets are always full of money, on condition that he does not wash or trim his hair or nails or pray for 7 years. If he does, he will lose his soul. But for the 5th edition of their book, the Brothers Grimm rewrote The Devil's Green Jacket, combining it with details from De Erste Bärenhauter, the first bear skinner, a story by Hans Jakob Christoffel von Grimmelshausen, a 15th century chronicler of the 30 Years' War. They turned the foolish young protagonist who undergoes the devil's ordeal into a soldier back from the war, and they changed the title of their story to Bearskin. To what end? Now, we don't have time to talk about the historical context. Just important for you to know that, intent on democratizing the princely German states and forging for their society a common cultural identity, the Brothers Grimm's published collections of folk tales and myths, as well as dictionaries of the German language. In volume 1 of their Deutsches Wörterbuch, 1852, the Grimms defined the term bearskinner, Bärenhäuter, as an ambiguous word, often used to reprimand someone as a layabout. But they point out that the word may also have had a positive connotation, and they cite Grimmelshausen as an example. The story the Grimms borrow from Grimmelshausen for their collection tells of a soldier who in 1396, when the Ottoman emperor invaded Hungary, escapes from a battle, kills a bear, wears the skin as a coat, lingering in this animal-human half-state until finally he sheds the skin, bathes in the Rhine, and makes his way successfully back into society. There's the cover page from an edition of Bärenhäuter. The Brothers Grimm took up Grimmelshausen's story and combined it with a traditional folk tale to tell of a soldier who returns from a war and now jobless falls into despair and finds himself bargaining for his life with a cloven-hoofed trickster. In their version of the story, the soldier puts on the green jacket because the coat will provide him with money during a 7-year trial, and over the green jacket he places the bearskin as the cloak he must carry on his back, as the bed on which he must lie. This layering does more than accentuate the stipulation of not washing, not cutting his hair and nails, not saying the Lord's Prayer for 7 years. Taking their cue from Grimmelshausen, the Grimms emphasize the soldier's change of identity. You shall be called Bearskin, the trickster spirit says to him. The Brothers Grimm's revised story becomes the chronicle of the endurance test that the protagonist must undergo in order to re-enter human society. By drawing attention to this layering of clothing and of narratives, literally, we've got 2 stories sitting on top of each other. We have the green jacket and we have the bearskin, and he's literally wearing a green jacket with the bearskin on top. So we have these 2 symbols sitting on top of each other and these 2 stories sitting on top of each other. The Brothers Grimm are pulling their readers back through time, from the 1800s and the Napoleonic Wars of their own day, to Grimmelshausen and the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, back to 1396 and the Ottoman invasion that Grimmelshausen employs as a setting for his own soldier's story. And taking up Grimmelshausen's example, the Grimms use their narrative to account for the etymology of the hero's name and to reconnect readers with the images embedded in common words. Jakob Grimm knew that the Old Norse language possessed two compound nouns, berserker, bear shirt, and ulfhelden, wolf coat, to describe certain warriors who entered battle screaming and biting the rims of their shields. These warriors fought in a frenzied state, vanishing foes without being injured themselves, and then fell into a deep sleep. They were as strong as bears, as crazed as wolves, and they had the power to render their enemies blind, deaf, and witless from fear. The early medieval chess pieces, now known as the Lewis chessmen in the collection of the British Museum, show the prevalence of this lore. Made in Norway around 1150, found in 1831 on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, 3 of the warders or rooks in the ancient chess set are berserkers, recognizable because they are biting their shields. In the Norse sagas, berserkers raped and murdered and were portrayed as villains. For example, in the Egil saga, attributed to Snorri Sturluson, the protagonist Egil narrates the saga of 3 generations, beginning in a pre-Christian Norway, and gives an astonishing account of his own grandfather, who, after being a berserker, retired quietly to his farm. Egil explains that when evening came, the old man would often become short of temper, become stygger, which means wary when applied to animals, and fall into a doze, during which time he was vulnerable to uncontrolled hamrammer, shape-shifting. Also, in the Volsunga saga, a father and son roam the forests, killing men for plunder to avenge wrongs done to the Volsungs by King Sigurd. But when they chance upon a pair of wolf skins and decide to wear them, they find themselves fighting and killing again, but now without motive. Their transformation into wolves becomes a kind of curse that they cannot control. Clearly, the Grimms named their soldier Bearskin in allusion to these berserkers who existed not just in legend, but also in recorded history. The berserkers having served as the household guard of King Harald the Fair-Haired, who forged a unified Norwegian state from 872 AD to 930 AD. Jakob Grimm devoted an entire chapter of the second volume of his Deutsches Mythology to tracing the theriomorphic notion of man-animal transformations in German mythology back to these Icelandic stories. It's not difficult to extrapolate from these stories of soldiers who went forth to combat, raging like wolves, biting their shields, in strength equal to furious bears, seeing those images and then moving a little bit forward to the later medieval lore of lycanthropy or werewolves, of humans gripped unawares by destructive states of mind. In the 20th century, psychoanalyst Bruno Bettelheim classified the theriomorphic element in such tales as the psychological struggle to humanize the Freudian id. Jung emphasized that without a strong psychotherapeutic container or frame, attempts to abreact or purge soldiers of difficult feeling states were dangerous. He compared the terrible psychological wounding that a soldier might suffer in a personal confrontation with the archetypal spirit of war to the biblical Jacob's dark night of the soul wrestling with a terrifying angel. As Joe Cambray mentioned last night, only after the Vietnam War did the American Psychiatric Association introduce into its diagnostic manual the term post-traumatic stress disorder to identify what psychiatrists of previous wars had often labeled male hysteria. Veterans, recognizing the social stigmatizing still associated with a psychological disorder, often prefer the neurological diagnosis of brain trauma that denotes a real wound rather than a phantom wound. In Bearskin, the soldier confronts what Grimmelshausen calls a spirit, and what the Grimms call the devil. First, the supernatural spirit tests that the soldier is indeed fearless, admonishing the young man to look behind. As if out of nowhere, a bear attacks, and the soldier shoots him, clearly by reflex. Grimm's dictionary work would suggest that this bear is itself the theriomorphic expression of the spirit of war. So the soldier kills the totemic animal form of his own berserker soldiering identity, and the spirit forces him to wear its skin for 7 years. What in wartime was his power and his pride is now in peacetime something that alienates him from the human society he served so fearlessly. Wherever he goes, people flee him, repulsed by his identification with the bearskin. The Brothers Grimm's revised tale speaks to a two-sided problem in their time. There is the question of the fearlessness of the soldier, of what to make of a wild warring spirit in peacetime, and there is the concomitant shadow question of his brother's hard-heartedness. When the soldier asks to come home, they answer, "You, soldier, are of no use to us. Go and make a living for yourself." The problem inherent to the heroic protagonist's psyche shifts in the nadir of the fourth of his 7 years of endurance, when he hears the sound of a bankrupted old man weeping, opens a door, and feels empathy for him. However, as the Brothers Grimm emphasize, the society to which the soldier has returned remains hard-hearted. In the context of war, the soldier has risked his life and survived, but he has done so as if unconsciously possessed by the spirit of war, alternating like a berserker between periods of inflated, spirited fury and comatose spentness. And now, in peacetime, he risks losing his soul because he can no longer swing back and forth between these two poles unaware, but must endure consciously the inflation and deflation of being both a fearless war hero and a homeless vagrant. The Grimms configure the return to society as a necessarily unheroic 7-year rite of passage, slowly building a self that is strong enough to bear itself as a verb, to endure the truth about itself, to carry that truth on his back, and to lie in the bed of that one-sidedness of self that was also the soldier's heroic ideal. What sustains the individual in such a psychological process? Curiously enough, not only the green coat that for 7 years pays the bills. Just as important is the framework or community that the soldier constructs around him by asking the poor he encounters to pray for him because he is not permitted to pray. And the illustrator of Max Grafe of this edition of Bearskin draws the prayers as butterflies. And when he meets one of the bankrupted father's 3 daughters, he breaks a ring in 2, giving her 1/2 and keeping the other for himself, and he continues on his journey for another 3 years, but now with the fragile hope that both inwardly and outwardly things may reconnect by the end of the 7th year. No doubt the Grimms knew the etymology of the Greek word symbolon, where we get our word symbol from, which literally means, a symbol in Greek is to break an object into 2 in order to make a transaction with another person. The transaction being completed when they meet again and put the 2 pieces together. The Greek classicist Anne Carson talks about this in her book, Eros, the Bittersweet. It's where we get our word from, and the symbol is the breaking of the object and then the idea that it comes back together. So there's a breaking of it into two, and then putting it back together. In other words, by the end of the 7 years, the soldier uses a symbol to reconnect intrapsychically the opposing parts of his self, as well as to reconnect interpersonally as a member of his society. A narrative of bearskin makes explicit the psychological map the Grimms drew to introduce as a fundamental piece of cultural knowledge into their society. The Brothers Grimm deliberately adapted the Devil's Green Coat and the Grimmelshausen story to make a very special and particular tale that reaches back through the centuries to the origins of pre-Christian Teutonic cultures, in order to address a dual problem in their time, and two of their brothers fought in the Napoleonic Wars: the suffering of soldiers and the hard-heartedness of society to the soldiers' plight. They created a story, both new and traditional, about how soldiers returning from active service must suffer long and difficult transformations in order to reintegrate. An ethical as opposed to a hard-hearted society, knowing this story, would commit itself to assisting better those who served it in wartime. In the little bit of time that remains, I would like to introduce a cautionary tale, a kind of real-life diabolically reversed version of the Grimm's tale. It's the case of a contemporary American soldier who suffered trauma, who may have wrestled with a tricksterish aspect of his personality, but without a therapeutic frame, without the eros connection and implicit hope in sharing symbolic transactions with another human being, and who acted out a terrifying transcendence. Now, I'm introducing the notion of a kind of negative transcendence that may feel slightly forced here. But I believe that negative connotations can attach themselves to the verb transcend. Etymologically, the image embedded in the word transcend is simply, literally, to climb across. Trans, across, sandera, to climb across. So synonyms could include to go beyond, to leave behind, to overshadow, to eclipse. In this particular case, moving into psychosis, including an explicitly religious vocabulary of rapture, of being seized or kidnapped, the soldier climbed across by murdering his wife and daughter and then committing suicide. In the context of the Grimm story, could we ask, what happens when the duplicitous nature of Trickster cannot be safely contained? In the account I'm about to mention, 3 lives were eclipsed, 3 souls taken. I've referred to this as a case, but I need to explain immediately that I'm only reporting on events after having read the soldier's journals and other writings, listened to his recorded monologues, and examining his personality test scores. I never met the man, and so I cannot diagnose his suffering. I'm permitted to report to you the little that I know because his story is already in the public domain. In 2016, I was approached by Alec Wilkinson, a staff writer at The New Yorker, and Eric Nelson, a documentary filmmaker, and I was asked to serve as a consultant for their research. They had learned about the disturbing controversy surrounding the deaths of David Crowley and his wife and his child, and they had gained access from the Crowley family to his recorded journals. They had visited the crime scene and interviewed Crowley's friends and family. Alec Wilkinson published his article entitled Death of a Dystopian in The New Yorker on April 10th, 2017. Eric Nelson premiered his film A Gray State at the Tribeca Festival a few weeks later. When I met and spoke with Crowley's father, it was clear that he hoped Wilkinson and Nelson might emerge with what the police investigation had not produced, a hypothesis to account for his son's actions. But in our discussions, Wilkinson and Nelson wisely resigned themselves to acknowledging that the why would remain unanswerable. Crowley was born in 1985 in Minnesota, a middle child with an older brother and sister. His father was an engineer. His parents divorced when he was 20. He followed his high school dream to join the military and served as a soldier in Iraq in 2006. There he witnessed and intervened after a car bombing killed more than 40 soldiers. He had a nervous breakdown, but there was no military medical history of treatment or psychological support. All this to say, during his time in Iraq, he experienced several traumatizing events. In 2007, he was transferred to Texas, where he met his wife-to-be, Komel Alam, whose family were recent immigrants from Pakistan. But immediately upon meeting her, he was stop-lost, a policy of forcibly retaining members of the armed forces on active duty beyond their original agreed period of enlistment. His service was extended without his consent, and against his will, he was sent to Afghanistan. He married Alam before he left. Once there, he refused to serve again in any capacity that required him to be responsible for another soldier's life, and he was eventually assigned to delivering the mail. He was discharged in 2009. The couple settled with their newborn daughter, Rania, in Minnesota, and he enrolled in a film course. His goal was to write, produce, and direct his own film to be called Gray State. We looked at his personality test scores because he did Myers-Briggs material, and maybe we can talk about that in the question period if you're interested in what his scores were like on the Myers-Briggs. In 2010, after graduating from his film program, he began writing his screenplay. The multiple drafts of the film script constituted a personal fantasy in which conquering forces take over the United States, imposing martial law. In all the versions of the screenplay, a state of war within is officially declared. The conscious ego function is carried by a hero protagonist. About this state of war, he notes, "That's how we impose martial law in other countries." We suggest here that the soldiering ego is somehow implicated, that he as an American is implicated historically. Martial law imposed by us on other countries is now imposed on Americans. The screenplay would show what happens if the code of martial law by which soldiers functioned were to be imposed on themselves as civilians. I read the screenplays, multiple versions of the screenplays, and I read them as a personal fantasy that kept shifting and evolving. The initial problem is identified in a prologue in a first image. A lone Taliban insurgent, turbaned and with a slung AK assault rifle, disappears into a cave. Here is an image of something armed, like Grimm's soldier with his gun at the beginning of Bearskin, and at the same time something other, retreating back into the dark, not coming forward into consciousness. Some function in Crowley's unconscious is identified with this figure. It's interesting that as in all of the screenplays, the fantasies shift and change, the plots shift and change, but overall, what is it that Crowley was trying to work out in these screenplays? He writes this at the end of one of them. The protagonist, Walker is the name of the protagonist. Walker has found a sense of self, place, balance, and is going to be protecting his territory by a restored moral code. The veterans have assumed a place in society as teachers against war, not sullen victims of it. If one rereads the screenplays with this statement in mind, one sees the through line that Crowley was trying to work out, how to find a sense of self, place, balance, morality within the territory of his psychic landscape, not to act out that part of himself that identifies only with a sullen victim of war. As the project grew and he got producers in Hollywood interested and signed a contract and was moving forward, he was losing control of the fantasy as fantasy. As long as he was working on it as a personal fantasy, it seemed to be contained. But the moment he started working on it with other people and was losing control with it, he started to have psychotic breaks. What was once called folie à deux, or shared psychotic episodes, still has a place in the DSM, currently as shared delusional disorder. Crowley's wife, Comella Lam, had completed her MA as a nutritionist when she moved to Minnesota and had been working in an institutional setting. Anticipating a movie contract, she quit her work and devoted her time to supporting Crowley, helping him to crowdfund for Gray State trailers, reading new versions of the screenplay. Her family, friends, and work colleagues experienced Crowley as possessively isolating her from them. On October 30th, 2014, she had a religious visionary experience which the couple called Rapture. A voice that identified as Egyptian said they were going to go away somewhere and that daughter Rania would come too. Contradicting her therapeutic training in nutrition, she began to research obsessively about religions in which members submitted to extremely long fasting practices, experiencing no need for food. So rather than the couple compensating for and humanizing each other's experience of possession, because in a sense they were both possessed, their recorded experiences point to psychic infection and an evasive flight into spirit as a promise of transcendence. On Christmas Day, Crowley shot his wife and daughter and then himself. So isolated had Crowley's household become, the bodies were not discovered on the living room floor of their home until January 17th. The police noted but did not report to the family that Crowley had written on the living room wall in his wife's blood. One of Crowley's friends recalled that they had talked about berserker Norsemen writing in blood to leave a message before dying. What he wrote on the wall was, Allahu Akbar, God is great. From our side of the page, as recipients of the story, what had Crowley climbed across into? What tricksterish aspect in Crowley's personal narrative took these three souls and had the last word? Is it admissible to see in Crowley's tragedy an echo of Grimm's cautionary tale of individual sacrifice in war and its aftermath, of society's responsibility towards its soldiers during and after the fulfillment of their duties? Thank you.